Euranet Plus Panorama is a weekly review of European news broadcast by our network of EU radio stations.
Hi there and welcome back to Euranet Plus Panorama. Driven by concerns over mental health, many EU member states are now proposing firm bans on social media use by minors. Some governments are taking things further than others, and as usual, not everyone is in agreement. At the end of January, France's National Assembly approved a bill to ban harmful social media for children under the age of 15. But a list of platforms deemed less harmful are to remain accessible with explicit parental approval. The bill is yet to be voted on by the Senate, but Emmanuel Macron's aim is to have the ban in place by September. Madrid subsequently announced a few weeks ago that Spain would also be banning social media for the under-16s. Meanwhile, Luxembourg's government supports a ban, but would like to see it come at EU level. But Gianni Di Paoli, a board member at the country's National Youth Council, tells 100.7 that he does not actually believe a ban is the answer here.
Young people will be confronted with the outside world anyway, so just cutting them off won't help them. We would rather see young people being part of a process by which they are provided with appropriate skills at 13 to 16 years of age and shown the way. I am a firm believer that platforms have to take responsibility, not just the young people themselves, and we have to take care to protect young people by providing them with the right tools with which to approach these platforms and giving them a better understanding of how they work.
Portugal is the latest European country to start putting plans in motion for nationwide restrictions on social media use for kids and young teenagers. In the ruling party's bill, which passed its first parliamentary vote just last week, a minimum age of 16 is being set, although 13 to 15-year-olds could have social media accounts if their parents give them the green light. The bill remains open to amendments posed by civil society bodies and political parties, but the government hopes it will be enforced within a few months. Ioli Campos is a researcher and lecturer specialising in digital media at the Catholic University of Portugal. In an interview with Renascença, she highlights an overlooked and somewhat perverse potential consequence of this kind of social media ban.
The problem with a law that prohibits something is that children will find ways around it. And since they will find ways around it, we must continue to focus on empowering them to recognise dangers, protect themselves from these dangers, and seek opportunities. And if they access social media by circumventing the law, there is almost a perversity here. What I mean is that if they are doing something illegal when they encounter such risks, will they have the courage to ask for help, knowing that they were doing something they shouldn't have been doing in the first place?
It's true that in Australia, the only country in the world to have actually implemented a legal ban on young people's access to social media, reports suggest that kids there have found ways around it from the get-go. This said, a more strictly implemented ban could have other negative consequences, as discussed in this week's episode of the Europeans podcast. For some teenagers living in difficult circumstances or dealing with complex issues, social media can be a real lifeline. Cutting these teens off from online interaction with their peers could be detrimental. However, notwithstanding the valid arguments against social media bans, the tide has well and truly turned, and there's a groundswell of opinion in favour of protecting the youngest members of our society from the risk of exposure to dangers that we have not even begun to fully understand. And, of course, a ban does send a clear signal that something is potentially dangerous and needs to be handled with care. Just think of the age restriction on smoking or the ban on drink driving. But how does such a policy really work in practice? How can accounts stemming from a particular geographical area even be identified in order to be age restricted? And this is not to mention the whole complex question of how a user's age can be verified. Greece's Minister of Digital Governance, Dimitris Papastergiou, tells our partners at Sky that there are ways and means.
There is no absolute solution, but there are now various technical options available. For example, platforms could be asked to identify accounts that are based in Europe or in Greece. And by that, I don't simply mean that users have declared they are in Greece, because that can easily be changed. Children often do this for fun, selecting more exotic locations. But through Greek phone numbers having been registered, since phone verification is now widely used for access control, or through social connections, like having friends who are also in Greece. In practice, there are now ways to identify Greek accounts.
While numerous European countries are individually making moves in this direction, national legislation has its limits. Yes, member states can set age limits and prohibit access, but only the European Commission has the legal authority under its Digital Services Act to sanction platforms for failing to put in place the requisite mechanisms to block underage users. With this in mind, Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez is spearheading the so-called Coalition of the Digitally Willing, whose remit will include coordinating and enforcing cross-border regulation of social media platforms. So far, there are said to be 6 European nations on board, one of which is Greece. Minister Papastergiou explains that their aim is to create the necessary momentum to push through change at a European level.
Because Europe is not known for moving quickly, a momentum has been created, with Greece taking the lead, alongside countries such as France, Spain and Denmark, to say that measures must be taken. This momentum now needs to mature into legislation.
So what is actually happening at a European level? Well, last summer, the European Commission published guidelines on the protection of minors within the framework of the Digital Services Act. These guidelines recommend that platforms mitigate risks to minors by blocking access to problematic content, ensuring account confidentiality, and reducing the risk of cyberbullying. And in its cyberbullying action plan published last week, the Brussels executive said that its expert panel would pave the way to a coordinated, potentially legislative European approach to age thresholds. For its part, the European Parliament voted in November in favour of a minimum age of 16 for accessing social media, 13 with parental consent, in a move that aims to edge us towards a harmonised EU standard. In addition, the Commission is working on a compulsory EU digital identity, or EID, wallet, which it hopes to introduce by the end of the year. It believes this to be the most effective way of preventing youngsters from circumventing the ban and of ensuring cross-border technical compliance. To close this discussion, let's turn to Victoria Behar, co-founder of the Out Loud Foundation, a Bulgarian NGO set up to fight disinformation and promote media literacy. In an interview with BNR, she points out that while it's vital to protect young people, we may be overlooking another extremely vulnerable group.
A study conducted by economists a few months ago shows that the most dependent group is actually older people who are excluded in one way or another from public life. They spend more time alone, and this is a window, for them to socialise, to have fun, to watch things. This is naturally also a way in for a lot of false information, misinformation, and who knows what else.
And on that note, we'll move on to a topic of more immediate relevance to our older listeners. I'm going to let Linda Givtash from the Euranet Plus fact-checking team introduce this topic herself.
With the Euranet Plus network of broadcasters, we've taken an interest in pensions, which are currently undergoing reform in the European Union. We've seen that these reforms are highly politicized and often combined with misinformation. This has led to concerns and negative reaction to the reforms, especially from future generations who fear they will be disadvantaged.
But in the grand scheme of things, Europeans have generally had it pretty good, haven't we? Don't we have some of the earliest retirement ages in the world?
The retirement age in the European Union is not significantly lower than elsewhere in the world, although there are significant variations between different member states. A NASDAQ report says that in 2023, 9 of the 10 countries with the lowest retirement ages were outside Europe. In that same year, the average retirement age in the EU was around 61, ranging from 58 years in Slovenia to nearly 66 years in Denmark. Meanwhile, the average age for OECD countries in 2024 was almost 65 years for men and 64 for women.
That's interesting, Linda. And is this picture likely to change?
Yes, many European countries are raising their statutory retirement ages, so averages are likely to go up in the years to come. Current policy changes will see retirement ages rise to 62 years in Luxembourg and Slovenia, and high as 70 years or more in Denmark, Estonia, Italy, the Netherlands, and Sweden, according to the OECD. I'd like to add here that the retirement age doesn't necessarily mean an end to employment. On average, 13% of Europeans continue to work after receiving their first old age pension, Eurostat reported. And in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Sweden, this figure was over 40%.
But countries are pretty much obliged to reform their pension schemes to mitigate the mounting costs of pensions on government budgets and the overall sustainability of the system, aren't they? Isn't there a risk of these costs crippling member states?
Although not yet crippling EU states, demographic shifts are resulting in pensions costing more as a proportion of a country's GDP, and this could increase government deficits. We found that back in 2020, the average level of pension contributions in Europe was 11% of the GDP. But the IMF says that pension spending in Europe is expected to go up by more than 40% between 2010 and 2060.
The IMF also reports that the average pension system deficit in Europe in 2020 was about 2.5% of GDP, and the 2024 Ageing Report warns that, without further policy changes, that deficit will grow to 8% of GDP by 2070. Does this mean that young people are at risk of receiving no pension at all when they eventually stop working?
That is one of the points that people are always making in this debate, and the answer is a mixed one. Young people today will receive public pensions in the future, but it probably won't be as generous as generations past. The European Commission's 2024 Ageing Report predicts significant discrepancies between people's final income and their first pension payment by 2070, meaning that young people will see smaller pension payments than they would have contributed into the system.
In your report, you quote experts who say that demographic transitions are predictable and the tools needed to address them exist, but that reforms collapse when they collide with electoral incentives and public mistrust. What's meant by this exactly?
France, for instance, saw major public backlash over a proposal to raise the retirement age, leading to the reforms being scrapped.
Just to put this in context, what is the current situation for French pensioners?
On average, French pensioners currently receive a pension that's equivalent to twice their own contributions.
That sounds extremely generous and highly unsustainable. But it's clear why young French people feel so aggrieved, particularly about the prospect of having to work longer, given the relatively long retirements their own parents and grandparents have been able to enjoy. Are we hearing similar complaints elsewhere in the EU?
Young Austrians have told local media they don't want to work until they're 80, while in Portugal, some complain they already have to work too long as the retirement age continues to be pushed back.
Surely, though, young people should be in favour of pension reforms, in the hope of safeguarding their own future entitlements. This said, not everyone agrees on how countries should go about equitably reforming their systems. Can you outline the debate in Germany, for example?
German liberals of the FDP party have said that the proposed pension reforms aren't enough and are unfair to young people and also failed to stabilize the system long term. Meanwhile, the think tank, the Foundation for the Rights of Future Generations, claimed that the reforms would only provide benefits to current pensioners while pushing the financial burden into the future. This rhetoric gets political backing as well.
So, are young Europeans simply doomed to have smaller pensions than previous generations?
Yes, but there's a but. Many experts and technical reports have argued that a combination of reforms, ranging from the raising of the retirement age to encouraging supplementary plans and targeted worker immigration, could help preserve a system that was indeed pretty generous compared to the rest of the world.
Thanks for sharing your insight with us again, Linda. All Linda's sources, links and more figures can be found on our website, www.euronetplus.eu. I'll sign off there. Join us again next week, same time, same place.